All right. Yeah, welcome everyone again as we head into the final session for the afternoon. Thank you, Dr. Davidenko, for coming. And yeah, obviously, so what you see affects what you hear. I'll kick it over to you, Dr. Davidenko.
Thank you so much, and really happy to be here presenting about our research. Just to introduce myself, I'm Associate Professor of Psychology at UC Santa Cruz, and I'm the director of the High Level Perception Lab. So a lot of what we study is interaction between visual perception, auditory perception, and other sensory modalities. So today I'm going to be telling you about some work we've been doing recently on how misophonia is not just about sounds. There's also a role for visual perception, and look forward to telling you about that work and to hear your questions. So we started this project with a simple premise and the idea that often sounds can be ambiguous. So it could be that the sound of dry leaves that you step on sounds kind of similar to the sound of paper being torn, which can sound kind of similar to somebody eating a crunchy chip, which is a common trigger in misophonia. And so it also turns out to be the case in perception science, perceptual psychology, that the visual domain, visual images and videos, can often influence how we interpret auditory events. So seeing an image of a person stepping on leaves or watching a video of a person stepping on leaves can provide enough cues that an otherwise ambiguous sound may be interpreted to be consistent with those cues. So we asked the question in our kind of guiding our research what happens if a trigger sound is misidentified? So our hypothesis was as follows. If a trigger sound is presented alongside a video that suggests an alternative source of that sound, then the misophonic reaction will be reduced. In other words, if a person is convinced that the sound that they hear is actually not a trigger sound, but something else that is suggested by the video they're seeing, that will change the way they respond to that sound. And specifically, in the case of misophonic trigger sounds, it will reduce the misophonic reaction. And so in order to study this and test that hypothesis, we spent some time developing a database of videos. We call these sound swapped videos, and I'll tell you more about them, as well as share a link where you can access the original videos. So the idea is we created 12-second video clips that would cover a range of misophonic trigger sounds, common misophonic trigger sounds that we gleaned from a series of interviews with individuals with misophonia. And then after recording these short video clips of somebody producing these trigger sounds, we created what we call positive alternative video sources, or PAVs for short, which are videos that can be synchronized to the original video. So the sounds happen at the same time, but provide an alternative potential source of that sound. So for example, the sound of crunchy chewing was paired with a video of somebody tearing a piece of paper in synchronization so that each chewing sound was synchronized with part of the paper being torn. The sound of wet chewing was paired with wringing of a rag. The sound of sniffing was paired with somebody sweeping a broom. And in all of these cases, the sounds were actual misophonic trigger sounds, but we created the original video that went with it, as well as these alternative videos that were played silently, but with overdubbing the original trigger sound onto them. And I'm not going to play any videos or any sounds for you, since they may be triggering for some folks, but I'm just going to show you some pictures that depict what some of the content of these videos are. So this is the first one I mentioned, somebody chewing something crunchy, and the alternative video is somebody tearing a piece of paper. Another example is somebody sniffing, and the alternative video is somebody sweeping to the same kind of rhythm as the person is sniffing. And another example is somebody squeaking on a glass window, and that's synchronized with a video of little puppies barking. So now I will tell you a little bit about the experiment we've run, and this is some data that we've collected recently. We recruited 26 individuals with misophonia and 31 control participants. And each participant came into the lab or completed the study remotely online. And they were asked to listen to a series of misophonic trigger sounds that were paired with the original video sometimes or with the alternative video sometimes. And after each sound that they heard, they were asked to provide some ratings. The first rating was a rating of pleasantness or unpleasantness. How pleasant or unpleasant did you find the sound? And then secondly, did the sound produce any bodily sensations? And we were interested here in the intensity of any bodily sensations that they felt. And both of these were recorded on a 1 to 7 scale. So I'm just going to jump right into the results. The first thing I'm going to show you is the distribution of misophonia severity across our participants. So we used the Duke Misophonia scale or Duke Misophonia questionnaire to assess the severity of misophonia symptoms. And what you can see on the top graph is that participants in the misophonia group had higher scores on this DMQ than participants in the control group. And this is just to ensure that we were really testing participants with misophonia compared to a control group. Now, in terms of the results of the experiment, here are the results for the pleasantness rating. So remember that people rated all of the sounds for how pleasant or unpleasant they were on a scale ranging from 1 being very unpleasant to 7 being very pleasant. And this is an average of all of the sounds they heard and of all the participants in each group. So the red bar you see on the left represents the average rating for the people in the misophonia group, and the bar on the right is the average rating for control participants. And you can see that both groups found the sounds rather unpleasant, but the misophonia group found the sounds more unpleasant, as you can see by their lower score on that scale. Now these are the results when people listen to the sounds with the original video sources that sort of confirmed that these were in fact trigger sounds. And what I'm going to show you next in green is the results when the same sounds were paired with these positive alternative video sources. So what you can see in this graph is that by providing this alternative video, the pleasantness ratings of all of these sounds significantly improved. So people found the sounds more pleasant when they were paired with these alternative video sources. And again, this is averaging across all the sounds and all the participants in each group. And these were very large effects, and they were significant for both groups. And the other result I'm going to show you now is the bodily sensation scale. So again, we asked people whether each sound produced bodily sensations and to rate them on an intensity scale, from 1 being no sensations to 7 being very intense sensations. And you can see here that the participants in the misophonia group rated higher bodily sensations than the control participants, about a 3 on that scale compared to about a 2 on that scale. And this is when they listened to the sounds along with the original videos. And what happened when we presented the sounds with the alternative videos? It significantly reduced bodily sensations. So the effect was much stronger actually for participants in the misophonia group. Their bodily sensations dropped from around 3 on that scale to just below 2 on that scale. And for the control participants, it's a more moderate drop. And to kind of put these results, to look at them in a slightly different way, this graph that you see here shows the amount of reduction in bodily sensations as a function of the severity of people's misophonia scores. So control participants here are shown in these black asterisks. Misophonia participants are shown with the white diamonds. And the x-axis represents the Duke Misophonia Severity score, and the y-axis represents the reduction in bodily sensations achieved by showing this alternative video. And you can see that the higher severity scores the participant experiences, the more benefit that they see from seeing this alternative video. So what do we conclude from our studies? Visual perception plays an important role in misophonia. Misophonia is not just about reactions to sounds out of context. Knowing what a sound is or believing that the sound is coming from one source versus another source makes a huge difference in how people react to that sound. And in particular, we showed that a video that suggests a positive alternative source of a trigger sound can increase the pleasantness of that sound compared to the original source, and it can decrease the intensity of bodily sensations produced by that sound. So one thing I'd like to say is that we've released our sound swap video database for use by the misophonia community, and that includes researchers and misophonia sufferers alike. So if you go to the link that I'm showing on this slide, or if you go to the QR code, you will go directly to the video database, which you can download these videos as well as look at aggregate ratings provided by a lot of different observers on those videos. So just to wrap up, I'm happy to tell you about some of the current work we're doing. We really want to turn this into a type of intervention for misophonia. So the idea would be that in a real life context where somebody is experiencing a trigger sound, can a person cope with the trigger sound by imagining this alternative source? In other words, can the simple act of imagining that a sound is coming from an alternate source that itself is not triggering turn out to benefit people in that context? And so we are doing some systematic studying of mental imagery and using mental imagery with the addition of videos as a training process to see if this cross-modal association between trigger sounds and non-triggering sources can produce similar benefits as we observe when people are actually looking at these alternative sources. So I'd like to thank you for your attention and for inviting me to give this presentation. And I'd like to also list my collaborators. I would highlight Dr. Pat Samermit, who is a co-investigator in this project, as well as several graduate students and many undergraduate students who contributed in significant ways to this work. Our work was funded by the Misophonia Research Fund. We've recently published our paper in the Frontiers special issue on misophonia, and you can access that paper at the link there. And again, you can find our sound swap video database at this link or at the QR code there.
Great. Yeah, no, thank you, thank you, Dr. Davidenko. Yeah, in your current work, I think you answered one of the questions I had, and it sounds like one of Chris's questions on how much we juxtapose sound for coping sounds like that's something you guys are looking at. A couple of the other questions, if you have anything to elaborate on it, but I have a couple other interesting questions that I've noticed here in the chat are, how long, do you have any sense of how long this decreased annoyance lasts for a moment where somebody's being triggered and then they may visualize something, or hopefully in the future just imagine it? Do you know how long it might last? Because I had a similar question. If it's happening, at some point does your brain recompensate and realize, oh, this is fake, you need to get mad? Do you have any sense if that's a phenomenon? Or...
Yeah, that's an excellent question, and it's something we are thinking about a lot. We've done some studies that get at this question a little bit, but a lot of the answer of that question is still in the future. So what we have done is compared what happens, and I see someone ask a question along these lines. Compared what happens if we present the original video first or the alternative video first. So in our studies, participants see both versions, but we do randomize the order. So some people see the alternative first, and some people see the original first, and the effect is reduced if a person sees the original video first. In other words, Having previous knowledge that this sound is actually a trigger and having seen the trigger source reduces this benefit that they observe, but it's not eliminated. And this is why we're encouraged to think that even if a person knows that the sound is a trigger sound, they can still experience benefits from remapping it to an alternative source. So it's a way in which the mind can sort of trick itself into perceiving something as something different, even if there's a deeper knowledge that the sound is actually a trigger. So this requires a lot more work because we've only done it, in a very specific way in the experiment. And regarding the original question about, how long do these effects last? That is the number one question we're interested in. We only know that it lasts, for a few seconds while that trigger is happening in the lab. That's all we've been able to show. But we are encouraged by some anecdotal evidence that people are starting to use this in their day-to-day lives. So just a quick mental trick of just reimagining a source can produce benefits even if that alternative source is not there.
Gotcha. Okay, yeah, I want to jump to there's a bunch of interesting questions coming in here. Wondering, do you? Somebody asked, pairing something with a positive visual, does that positive visual could that become a trigger? Could that be a learned? Could that turn negative?
Totally good question. We've thought about that as well. One of the ways that we sort of preempted this a little bit is in our interviews, we asked folks about their history with misophonia and how it's changed over time and how recently or how frequently do new sounds become triggers for them. And for the most part, there's kind of a fairly fixed set of triggers that arises earlier in life. And it does happen that new sounds can become triggers, but it's not as frequent. We haven't seen any cases with our research that some of these non-trigger events like walking on leaves or tearing paper, we haven't seen cases where those become triggering, but it could certainly happen. And we're thinking about, if that happens, what to do about it, or try to at least be aware of it so we are not unwittingly introducing new triggers for folks.
Right. And I'm sure mesokinesia. I'm wondering if that was because that could, I don't know, pollute the study or affected somehow. I'm just curious if that was controlled for.
Yes, we asked folks about mesokinesia in our interviews, and a good number of participants with misophonia also had mesokinesia. We did not screen them out for that. We didn't find any differences in these benefits for people with or without mesokinesia. One thing we are interested in, this is a little bit different, but we are interested in the role of mental imagery. And there are standard tests of mental visual imagery abilities, and we are curious if that is going to be sort of a predictor of whether this technique works. So if a person has like a really good ability to conjure images of things, then is this kind of technique more effective for those folks?
Gotcha. Okay. Yeah, no, very interesting. And then I guess okay. So yeah, I'll read another interesting question. Interesting that there were low intensity bodily sensations noted in response to triggering cues. Do you think this means body responses are not especially important in general among people with misophonia? Like if like the ratings of unpleasantness intensity were much more pronounced, might this be a clue suggesting that effective sense of unpleasantness is more important than strength of the body sensation when people are triggered?
So, yeah, that's a good question. I wouldn't necessarily conclude that. So we presented people with about 13 different trigger sounds in the experiment, and not everybody is affected by all of the sounds. So these bodily sensation ratings that you're seeing are being averaged across all of the sounds. So for any particular individual, there may be 2 or 3 sounds that really trigger intense bodily sensations, but it's being sort of averaged down by the fact that we're averaging across 13 videos. The reduction in bodily sensations was really mostly observed in people with misophonia. So I think the opposite, actually. I think bodily sensations is exactly the right thing to think about, and not just self-reports of bodily sensations, but other ways to access it. So physiological measures, for example, sweat response or EMG response, heart rate, potentially pupil responses. A lot of it is felt in the body, and we have some data that I wasn't able to talk about today about the way that people describe these bodily sensations, and the way that those descriptions change when presented with these alternative videos. So I think the last point I wanted to make is that these videos are 12 seconds long. So normally triggering situations can last much longer than that, and the feelings tend to increase over time. So the fact that these are relatively low in the lab maybe just reflects that they were fairly short duration sounds.
Cool. You see, so I'm not sure how deeply you got into, or the study got into, like why the pairing of these videos might be decreasing the severity. Do you have any I don't know, hypotheses as to kind of why? Obviously, you showed the results, and they're
Well, the hypothesis is that it's not just a sound. It's not just a sound mapped directly to an emotional or physical or cognitive reaction. It's the interpretation of the sound to a large degree. So what is the sound? What is making the sound? Who is making the sound? Why are they making the sound? All of those contextual factors are part of the misophonic experience. So the simple process of remapping a sound to a different source, that source is not triggering. So even if the sound itself has some triggering elements, changing the source is a big part of it. So I hope that answers the question. It's just the idea that the reaction to misophonic sounds is not just a function of the sound wave. It's a function of the holistic understanding of that situation, that triggering situation in the kind of social context. So by doing this cross mapping, we kind of break that connection a little bit.
Gotcha. Okay. And do you find, and obviously, I think you just did the study. It hasn't really turned into an intervention yet, but I'm curious if it might get like somebody has to consciously go through their entire day and think about remapping the sounds that they hear. I'm wondering if that would get exhausting, or how feasible that would be, or how practical that would be to be an intervention, or there might have to be some practice period involved. I'm curious if you've maybe pondered that as you're kind of contemplating future studies.
Yes, that's a great question, and it's we're sort of in the midst of that kind of work. So one of the first things is, like, how do you get people to do that remapping, right? And so we have developed like a paradigm that starts with visual presentation of the alternative sources, then concurrent presentation of the original source with the alternative source, and asking people sort of to attend to the alternative source, then removing both sources and having people think about the alternative source. And I do think that it will take some practice, but I don't think it will require like constant daily, every moment of the day practice. I think it could be learned relatively quickly by people, but it's an open question. We don't really know the answer.
Gotcha. Okay. And a question about other senses, like are there other contextual elements, like certain smells or tactile experiences, that might also influence the intensity? Like, could you map with other senses instead of just visual? Obviously, it kind of depends on what the sound is, but
yes, absolutely. And initially, we were just as interested in the tactile modality as we were in the visual modality. And most of our participants with misophonia also reported having negative reactions to certain tactile sensations or textures, touching or feeling certain tactile sensations.
It's kind of interesting because, I mean, hearing is in a sense of touch. It's sound waves touching, the hairs or whatever in your ears. So there's kind of a different form of touch. I'm wondering if that might be closer.
Yeah. But it can also happen if the person themselves is touching something. So like just the act of touching something or feeling something or a sensation can produce similar reactions. And I think in theory, this idea could apply in the tactile domain. So if you're touching something that makes you reinterpret what sound you're hearing because of what you're touching, that could have a similar effect as seeing something. It's just much harder to design experiments around that. And we ended up just sticking to the visual and auditory domains, but very good question.
Gotcha. How are we doing on time, Chris? So I want to be...
You've got 8 minutes.
Oh, perfect. Okay.
So
cool.
35 after, yep.
Yeah. Let's see. Just scrolling through. They come in pretty fast and furious here. Yes. Okay. Well, yeah. Here's a question I missed. So if people watch first the original video, somebody said, I think they would have remembered it even when watching the modified video would have been made. In terms of my daughter keeps the trigger sound in her head for a long time. I think if they watch first the one modified, the results would be better.
Yes.
So I guess it's a question about the order.
Yes, the order matters. We've shown that.
I think you said you randomized it a little bit in the study.
Yeah. So in the data that I actually showed today, we presented the alternative sounds first, and the original sounds second. Okay. So we were aiming for the biggest effect, but the order matters. And in the study where we did randomize it, we saw clear differences between when the original was first versus second. And if I had to kind of quantify the effect, it's about a third of a reduction of the effect. So if the reduction of the effect is this big when you see the alternative first, then it's about this big if you see the original first. And this idea that sound kind of lingers in people's heads after being exposed to it is definitely part of it. And so I think that's the key question, whether people can use this technique when they already know what the true source is. But we do lots of research in my lab in other domains aside from misophonia, where we sort of examine top-down processes in perception. So, and there's many effects that kind of survive this knowledge effect. In other words, there's certain top-down influences that people can exert in their perception that they can exert whether or not they know what the true nature of the stimulus is. And one of those areas in my work is on motion perception. So we present people with an ambiguous motion stimulus. We tell them that they should be looking for up and down motion, and they immediately see up and down motion. Or we tell them that they should be seeing left and right motion, and they immediately see that. And then we tell them that there's actually no real motion, it's all random. And then they can still get themselves to see up and down or left and right. So that's an example where even knowing that there's no real motion signal in the stimulus, people can exert that top-down control. Now, whether it's going to be exactly the same in misophonia, I don't know, and I don't think so. And I think that for some people, it may not work for that specific reason. The knowledge of what the true source is may be overwhelming and difficult to dissociate. In our paradigms for kind of training this technique, we start with the alternative source to give people the biggest kind of sense of the effect that we can at the beginning. Once they realize that, wow, listening to this sound when I thought it was coming from this person stepping on leaves really made a difference in the way I felt. So later, now that they know that the sound is actually somebody chewing, they might still remember that difference in how they perceived it under that false association. And so the question is then, can they reproduce that voluntarily? And gotcha. for some folks, it seems that they can, and for others, they may not be able
to. Interesting question from Dr. Frenia now. She wonders if matching visual and auditory triggers leads to like a perceptual overload in comparison to unmatched triggers. It might have related to my question about like, it could just be potentially exhausting to go through your day, like trying to match these things. It might be a slightly different question, but
Yeah. So I'm not, if
question
I'm under,
on perceptual overload.
I think if this question is sort of like about the effort, the effort that it takes to kind of conjure these mental images and map them, I think it's a question. Yeah, this may be perceptual overload, but it might be better than the alternative, which is just kind of hyper focusing on the triggering sound, right? So the idea, it could be difficult at first, or sort of effortful at first, but once the mapping is there, it might actually allow the person to be distracted away from that sound.
Gotcha. I mean, so yeah, so it sounds like there's a bunch of different directions that we could go in after your study. What would you like to see happen next, or is there what's kind of next for your group, and where would you like to see this study go?
Yeah, so I think maybe two big directions that I think are worth pursuing. First, what I mentioned earlier, which is the long-term potential benefits of this as an intervention, and we're just getting started with that work. And it requires collaboration with clinical psychologists, because I'm not a clinician. I study basic human perception, and so we need sort of support from clinical psychologists who have more expertise in sort of tracking long-term progress, and couching this intervention within maybe more well-known interventions that apply more broadly. The other important direction, I think, is to understand physiologically what's happening. And like I said, so far our studies have involved self-report measures, so people just rating how this makes them feel or describing how this makes them feel. But it would be very nice to be able to back that up with physiological measures, brain measures, bodily measures, because if we see a significant change in those, I think it would make these results a lot more concrete. So it's not just people are reporting that they find these sounds more pleasant, or that they feel less bodily sensations. But if we can see that in physiological data, I think it would really strengthen our conclusions.
Great. Well, yeah, thanks. Thanks, Dr. Davidenko. Fascinating talk. I think that closes us out, and we'll be heading into the panel. We'll probably see you in there as well. But thanks everyone for coming and asking great questions.
Thank you so much. Thank you for your questions too.
All right.
Thanks.
Let's head to the panel, boys and girls.